This isn't his first rodeo. Jay McGovern is a Navy veteran and engineer, but he has also made a serious side hustle out of running for office. To tell us what keeps him in the fight, I'm joined by District 5 congressional candidate Jay McGovern. Welcome, Jay.
Thanks, Ann. I appreciate it.
So we were talking a little bit before the show. I first interviewed you back when I was in print media.
Right.
At the time, you were running against Andrew Crenshaw, who was a congressman,
Right.
basically representing the same area. And then since then, you ran for U.S. representative against then Representative Ron DeSantis, or in that race. Also for State House rep, the seat that's held by Wyman Duggan. That was in 2020. So you are a bit of a serial candidate.
Yes.
Yeah. What keeps you going?
Well, simply the fact that it's not getting any better. And, I first became a candidate because I thought after the Iraq war started and I saw, both the fact that we entered the war as well as the fact that I didn't really think we were necessarily prosecuting it well. I realized as a member of the military, if I wanted to really affect that, it would have to be one of the civilian leaders. And so that's how I got on the path to do that. And I think about where we are today. And unfortunately, we're talking about a lot of the same issues, immigration, the debt, Social Security solvency, healthcare, and these are man-made problems. And I really do feel like we can do better at solving them.
Do you get discouraged, not just as a participant in the political process, generally speaking, but as a candidate who, despite running in these races, hasn't had a victory?
Right. Yeah, sure. I mean, losing's not fun. But when I was first thinking about running, I asked my wife, I said to my wife that I wanted to run, and she said, no. And I said, no, seriously, I want to run. And she said, yeah, seriously, no. And, and I said, why? And she said, because I don't want to read bad things about us in the paper. And I honestly was going to, just walk away from it at that point. And I had this moment of clarity a week or so later. And I thought there's worse things than reading bad things about me in the paper. And it's reading bad things about this country and having been afraid to fix them. And so I know, gerrymandering is what it is. And these districts are difficult to win. But I think the stakes are pretty high. And, I didn't get in this race till very late, and I really kind of thought I would never run again. But John Rutherford didn't have a Democratic opponent, and I thought he shouldn't have a free pass based on his job performance. And so I signed up again.
We're talking to Jay McGovern. He is a candidate for District 5 seat in Congress, and you can join our conversation. You can email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can call us on air at 904-549-2937. We're taking your calls and questions. Why is it important that a race be contested in your mind, regardless of who's in the seat?
Well, I think it conveys to the representatives, the incumbent, what the people in the district are thinking, and hopefully provide some accountability for his or her votes when they do go to Washington.
We should say we have reached out to your opponent, John Rutherford, a few times, called and emailed to invite him on the program, and have not heard back. But this campaign, is it going to be any different in your mind than your previous races?
Yeah, I think there's, I was talking to a friend of mine about the energy, particularly since Vice President Harris has entered the race. There's not only an optimism in it, but there's a resolve. I feel that there's people who are saying they're optimistic about America's future and they're resolved not to continue the fear, the negativity, and all those kinds of things. And I think it's going to positively affect voter turnout, and that would help me. And I think I've committed to not being a negative campaigner. I mean, obviously, I'll talk about my opponent's record, but I won't attack him personally. I don't think there's any value in that. I mean, that's not what we heard it at the presidential debate, and it just, we're tired of that. We're just tired of it. And so it's time to move on, be optimistic, first replace chaos with order, but also replace fear with optimism. I'm an engineer, and so my business is solving problems. As I mentioned before the show, a lot of the problems that we face are man-made problems. And I just think about what our parents and grandparents did for this nation, whether it's fighting back fascism in World War II or curing polio or the space race. And I just find it astonishing that our representative and members of Congress don't feel like they can fix immigration or how we deliver health care. I mean, I'm not suggesting that I can make healthcare outcomes better, but I can certainly deliver healthcare better. I mean, I just don't think in America people should go bankrupt because someone they love got sick. And I think we could all agree on that. And so let's just figure out how to do that, And I think together, I don't think I'm the smartest guy in the world, but together I think we're pretty strong and pretty smart, and I think we can solve it.
It's a time where bipartisan initiatives, however, are, often die on the vine. And it seems like there's more of an interest in creating conflict, maybe where it doesn't need to exist.
Exactly. I mean, right now, Mike Johnson postponed, the Speaker of the House postponed a vote on a continuing resolution because within his own party, he can't whip the votes to include the SAVE Act in the continuing resolution. Instead of jettisoning the 10 people or whatever number of people that don't agree with him on that and finding 10 Democrats and passing a continuing resolution or stripping out the SAVE Act or doing what he needs to get it passed, they feel like they can only do things with their party. And so instead of building coalitions and governing with coalitions, they try to rule with a majority. And it's just not serving our country.
I mean, to be fair, he'd probably lose his speakership if he did that, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does something like gerrymandering figure into that kind of a circumstance, that kind of a ultra partisan environment?
Well, typically the gerrymandering results in the politicians who draw the districts picking constituents instead of constituents picking lawmakers. And what they do is, a lot of people advocate for term limits, but gerrymandering kind of is the backdoor way around that, because if you have term limits and gerrymandering, you end up just replacing that person with someone that has the same ideology because they've drawn the district that way. And so that's really the challenge.
That may not be something that the needle is going to move on unless there's,
Correct. Unless people like me can win in gerrymandered districts, right? And so it's up to the voters to decide, whether, in my case, that it's basically the Republicans have an 11-point advantage in the 5th congressional district. So I have to get, 11% of non-Democrats to get over onto my side, and that's a tall order.
Money's an obstacle, I would imagine. The last that we checked, your opponent had about about $600,000, maybe almost $700,000. You've got $32,000 roughly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a giant disparity.
It is a giant disparity, and to be honest, one of the things that I've learned from the other campaigns is I haven't really aggressively tried to raise funds. I did what all the political consultants said to do in the other races and, get on the phone and call and call and call. But the truth is those people that donate, they understand the handicapping of the races. And frankly, that's a tremendous waste of my time and theirs, because they're going to invest in the R+2 or the R+3 race, not the R+11. And so I understand the game a little better. And so my approach is to communicate more with electronics and social media. Obviously, it's cheaper, but also target my audience into Republicans who don't typically vote in the primary and non-party affiliated voters as more probably persuadable voters.
And so are you able to utilize the model demonstrated by our current Democratic mayor in Jacksonville, who many people thought had very little chance of winning because
Correct.
Because Republicans were expected to kind of turn out and force and make that happen?
Yes, I think so. I think one of the things that I just love about Mayor Diggins' race is she kept it positive. She kept it positive about her vision for the future of Jacksonville. And that resonated with people. And her opponent pulled out the same old tricks, all the negative campaign ads. He had tons of money, and it got him nowhere. And I think that's where you could begin to sense that we're over this, enough already. The voters are tired of that negativity. So I think in my race, there's that is a little bit of an advantage for me. My opponent has not done particularly well in his Republican primaries, so there's a lot of Republican voters that are not thrilled with Representative Rutherford. And I think there is a belief this year that Democrats will turn out more than Republicans will turn out. So I'm hoping all those three things will help.
Although his primary opposition, I would think it's fair to say, ran probably to the right of where he is, and he's a pretty staunch conservative.
Right. And his opponent, who I met with this week, she is clearly to the right of him, which I don't necessarily think a lot of those people will vote for me, but I think a lot of those people may not vote for him.
So you are, as you said, you're an engineer. You were in the Navy for decades.
30 years.
Yeah. How do those vocations inform the way that you run or your priorities?
So I think the way I run, first of all, between being a retired military and an engineer, I run in a very methodical way. I follow the data, and I am looking at that in a very practical way. I realize it's an uphill battle, but I have a path, I have a plan. I may not get there, but I have a path and a plan to get to 50% plus one. As far as from a policy perspective, I mentioned that I didn't really care for us entering the Iraq War, and I certainly didn't like the fact that we were on a war footing for 20 years. But I look at national security differently. So here's the deal, is no matter how much you spend on defense, you can't build a strong nation with sick, uneducated kids. So we need to double down on public education. We need to make sure we have strong, educated children. That is national security. And I would argue that's more important than the money you spend on an F-35. It's the basis, it's the foundation of national security. And so I think we're looking at a lot of the issues the wrong way.
What kind of changes do you think would help in terms of creating a better, less sick or better educated populace?
First of all, there's a children's health care program, and I would expand that to include all children, not just children under a certain income category, because they're generally a very healthy cohort. So it's not a particularly expensive. You're really talking about mostly physicals and preventive medicine, vaccines, and those types of things, asthma, and things that you can do to prevent those children from becoming diabetic, from becoming disabled as adults, will pay dividends in the long run. So that's on the healthcare side of it. On the education side of it, I'm not a big fan of charter schools, but I'm willing to concede that train's left the station, right? But I do think that those schools need to follow the same rules that our public schools follow. And I think, having the same curriculum, having the same rules and requirements and testing will help us build that solid education base.
Why are you not a fan of charter schools?
Because they pick and choose who they accept. And I think it's a way for political donors to basically pull money into the private sector, as in my personal opinion, as a form of graft. I mean, they did it with private prisons first. They just looked at the biggest items in the state budget, and they went after those things. You could argue defense and Medicare is done the same way on the federal side.
In Florida has gone a little farther than charter schools, obviously, in recent years. Most recently last year, when tax dollars now can follow students to private schools.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, if we're going to do that, if we as a society agree that we're okay with that. I just think that they need to have the same standards, and I don't think they should be able to turn down students either. So if a special needs student comes to them, their school should have to accommodate that, and even if it requires, you know, adding to their facility and adding to their faculty.
So you recently retweeted a tweet from a local school advocate talking about a school board member that has spewed bigotry on social media, and another who profits off vouchers and school closures as a homeschool professional. Are you following those races? Did you follow those races? What are your feelings about the local school board election?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Amendment 1, I think our races should stay nonpartisan. I mean, there's no place for partisanship in school board races. I mean, it's whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, or something else, there's no question that education is a core government function, and we should fund it appropriately, and we should all get on board with how that's done. And to have leaders that spew bigotry and other things is just beneath us, beneath our values. And it's extraordinarily disappointing to me.
So, your opponent, John Rutherford, is there a particular policy of his that you oppose? Is there something about his leadership style that you object to?
Uh, Um, Again, I think we live in a coastal district. He voted against the Infrastructure Reinvestment Act, and our district really could benefit from rebuilding our infrastructure in a more resilient way. Um, that's one thing, but I just feel like he doesn't really champion a whole lot of things other than a few things to help first responders, like get down payment assistance and all that kind of stuff, and that's fine. But we haven't passed a budget on time in Congress since 1996, and I just don't see him taking a leadership role. He's kind of voting the whip sheet. He sort of does, what is asked of him by his party bosses instead of what's asked of him by the people in the district.
Other than education, you mentioned child health care. What would other priorities of yours be if you were elected?
Well, immigration reform is on a lot of people's mind. I don't think we can have a robust, growing economy without legal immigration. And I really think we need to expand legal immigration and provide a pathway to citizenship. We haven't done anything meaningful like that since Ronald Reagan was president. And when he did it, he granted amnesty to millions of people, and absolutely nothing bad happened in our country. Our economy just grew. And we brought people out of the shadows and treated them with dignity and respect that they deserve, which I think are our values, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or something else. And I think we should just do that again. And
I mean, that would solve the problem for people who are in country, but I think everybody agrees that there is a bit of an influx that is difficult to manage in terms of just absorbing new citizens or new people that are trying to become citizens.
Well, actually, I don't think there is. I think we're able to absorb them and employ them, as evidenced by our unemployment rate being so low. What I have a problem with is how much we're spending at the border trying to, detain and make people follow the law. I don't support people who come in illegally. I think making legal immigration easier would help solve our border problem and help us reduce our costs that we spend in enforcement on the border. If people can come in the front door and even pay for a work visa, I mean, they're willing to pay a coyote or whatever they call them, to smuggle them across the desert, they'd probably be willing to pay for a work visa. So why not make it just easier for people to come in the front door, track them, give them an identification number and, have them stay in touch and all that stuff and collect taxes on them.
But you don't think that there is a point at which that would be unmanageable?
Well, I think, you can't look at that in a vacuum. I think there's other efforts that Vice President Harris was involved in with improving the economies of our country south of the border in Central and South America. I think those are critical to having that, flux decreased. I mean, if people could make a good living in their own town safely, they would really have no motivation to to come to the United States.
Sure, but we're looking at a lot of destabilized governments down in South and Central America, and also climate refugees. You're seeing people that are being displaced either because of rising waters or intense
Yes,
heat, and so that migration issue, I think we could only expect will grow.
that's absolutely true worldwide. And in fact, the Defense Department in its national strategy years ago even said that. And the next logical extension of that is that migration is going to cause conflict, which is going to require oftentimes military intervention. It's going to cause civil war and those types of things around the world.
It makes it a little hard to run a sunny, positive campaign when the issues are kind of dispiriting. I mean, how do you manage those conflicting, perhaps, realities?
Well, the first thing, I mean, you got to focus. You have to focus on the things that are important. And instead of running culture wars, I mean, like right now, the SAVE Act that they're trying to tack onto the continuing resolution is, you know, purportedly to keep illegal or non-citizens from voting. Well, that's already against the law. And if you make another law and somebody's willing to break the first law, I don't really see how that's going to, keep them from breaking a second law. So it's just a waste of time. And so we're focused on the wrong things. And I think bringing attention to, you know, climate change causing migration that leads to conflict and doing those types of things and getting on the front end of that is important. It also shows how important our strategic alliances with NATO, EU, and our Trans-Pacific partnerships are. I mean, we've got to focus on all of those things. We've got to be able to do more than one thing at a time.
I want to ask you, you said that when you first decided to run, your wife was a firm no. Did her position change? And I would say that in the context of seeing bad things written about you has only probably gotten more extreme.
Right. Well, a week or so later, I think I mentioned that I had a moment of clarity, and I said, being afraid to try to fix the bad things I was reading about in the paper is worse. And I told her that, and she said, "Let's get it done." And so she's on board and has been very, very supportive.
But it is difficult, I would guess, to be in the public eye no matter what. And, in an age of social media, that gets more difficult.
Sure, and particularly for someone like me, that as you pointed out, this is my fourth time as a candidate, and I've never won. And you look like this, knucklehead perennial candidate, and but I would say that it's still a necessity that we continue to try. I mean, we have American ideals. We don't necessarily live up to them every day. We don't give up on them when we fail, and so I think that that's an important thing. And I watched the debate the other night, or I was actually listening to debate the other night, and the former president said, "You've had 3.5 years to fix these things. Why haven't you fixed them?" Well, he had 4 years to fix things, and he didn't fix them. And I would argue that neither one of them accomplished those because Congress isn't sending them the bipartisan legislation that they need to. Congress is the part that's broken.
Well, on your journey to try to fix it, Jay McGovern, thanks for stopping by and catching us up on your campaign.
Thank you so much, Ann. I appreciate you having me. And